The world was no longer recognizable. Cities that once bustled with life had turned into eerie ghost towns, overrun by the undead. Survivors, few and scattered, clung to what little hope remained, surviving on instinct, makeshift weapons, and the occasional scavenged food. They didn't know where the infection had come from, but it didn't matter anymore. What mattered was survival, and that meant avoiding the monsters that roamed the streets. Jackson, a former truck driver, had spent the past 3 weeks holed up in an abandoned farmhouse on the outskirts of a small town. He had barricaded every window, reinforced the door, and created a small fortress out of whatever supplies he could find. He spent his days in a haze, moving between fitful sleep, scavenging trips, and a constant, gnawing anxiety about what would come next. He hadn't spoken to another living person since the outbreak began. And for the most part, he preferred it that way. Yet, one night, as he sat alone in the darkness, the crackle of a radio broke the silence. It was faint at first, barely a whisper beneath the overwhelming static. Jackson froze, his hand hovering over the dial of an old, battery-operated radio he'd found in the farmhouse. The signal was weak, but it was unmistakable. Someone was broadcasting. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest as he twisted the dial, trying to tune into the mysterious signal. His hands trembled, unsure if it was some kind of cruel trick, but the voice on the other end was clear, desperate. "This is Station X. If anyone can hear this, please listen. The key to survival is hidden in the heart of the city. Follow the radio signal. Trust no one but the broadcast. The undead are only part of the danger. The real threat is still out there, and they know you're listening." Jackson's breath caught in his throat. The static returned almost immediately, drowning out the message. He sat there in stunned silence, unsure of what he had just heard. His mind raced with questions. What was Station X? Was this a trap? Who could possibly still be alive to broadcast a message in this hellscape? But Jackson couldn't shake the pull of hope that gnawed at him. Maybe this was a lifeline. Maybe someone, somewhere, was out there with answers. He couldn't ignore the possibility. The idea of finding something, anything, that might help him survive was the first spark of hope he'd felt in weeks. Grabbing his pack, Jackson began to prepare. He gathered the essentials: water, a few cans of food, his flashlight, and his trusty hunting knife. He paused for a moment, his fingers brushing the edge of a faded map he had found in the farmhouse. He stared at it, unsure of where to begin. The city was miles away, and the route was treacherous. But the voice on the radio hadn't given him much choice. With one last glance around the room, Jackson stepped out into the night. The air was thick with humidity, the sky an oppressive shade of gray, as though the world itself had given up on ever seeing sunlight again. The only sounds were the distant moans of the undead and the soft crunch of his boots on the cracked dirt road. Jackson had no idea what he would find. But the voice on the radio had mentioned the heart of the city. He had to believe there was something to it, anything that could help him understand the truth of what had happened, and maybe even a way out of this nightmare. Jackson's journey into the heart of the city felt like a descent into madness. The road that had once been a simple country route was now littered with debris, twisted metal, abandoned vehicles, and remnants of a world that no longer existed. He kept to the shadows, moving carefully, always listening. The undead weren't the only threat in this new world. People, desperate for survival, had become far more dangerous than the monsters roaming the streets. As he neared the city limits, the air grew thick with a strange, almost tangible sense of dread. The buildings loomed overhead like silent sentinels, their broken windows staring out like hollow eyes. A fog had settled in, blanketing everything in a suffocating gray. He couldn't see more than a few feet in front of him, and every step felt like he was walking on the edge of a razor blade. He'd heard the stories, the ones that spoke of survivors banding together in small groups, trying to create their own order amidst the chaos. But Jackson wasn't foolish enough to trust anyone just yet. Not until he had more answers. Not until he knew who was behind that cryptic radio message. With each step, the silence weighed heavier on him. The distant sounds of groaning undead and the occasional thud of a door slamming shut were the only signs of life he encountered. It was almost too quiet, as though the city itself was holding its breath. Suddenly, the static of his radio crackled in his back. Jackson froze, his heart skipping a beat. The voice was back. It was faint, but unmistakable. "Keep moving," the voice warned. "They're closer than you think. Don't stop for anything. Trust the broadcast. Trust only the signal." Jackson's pulse quickened. The broadcast was guiding him, but what did they mean by they? Was it the undead? Or something else? He had no answers, only more questions. But one thing was certain, he couldn't stop now. He moved faster, ducking into alleyways and avoiding the main streets. His instincts were honed, alert to every creak of the building's structure, every shuffle of the undead. The fog had become thicker, and he had to rely on the dim glow of his flashlight to navigate. His mind kept going back to the words on the radio, "The real threat is still out there." Was it another group of survivors? Or something more sinister? Jackson couldn't help but wonder. The undead were horrifying enough, but the possibility of something far worse lurking in the shadows gnawed at his thoughts. He reached the outskirts of the city center just before dusk, and his breath caught in his throat as he saw it. Towering above the fog was a colossal radio tower, its silhouette stark against the darkening sky. The signal was coming from there. The voice was leading him toward it. But as he stood there, staring at the tower, Jackson couldn't shake the feeling that he was being watched. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. He turned slowly, scanning the area. For a moment, he thought he saw a shadow flicker at the edge of his flashlight's beam, but when he looked, there was nothing there. Just the endless expanse of empty streets and abandoned buildings. His hand instinctively went to the knife at his side, and he tightened his grip. His instincts were screaming at him to move, to keep going, to get to the tower before whatever was watching him decided to make its move. With a deep breath, Jackson pushed forward, heart racing. He couldn't afford to hesitate. Not now. He was so close. The closer Jackson got to the radio tower, the more the city seemed to close in on him. The fog clung to every corner, every window, turning the once vibrant cityscape into an unrecognizable maze of crumbling buildings and skeletal remains. He could barely see more than a few feet ahead, and the cold air seemed to carry the scent of decay, of death, of things that shouldn't be. Jackson's mind raced. Trust only the broadcast. That was all he had to go on. But every step felt more dangerous than the last. He could hear the faint groaning of the undead in the distance, but it was something else that was unsettling. A soft scraping sound. Like something, or someone, moving just beyond the edge of his vision. He quickened his pace, ducking into an alley, the crumbling walls seeming to lean in on him like silent observers. He scanned the area, feeling that prickling sensation at the back of his neck again. Something wasn't right. As he turned another corner, he stumbled upon an overturned car, its tires long deflated, windows shattered. A perfect hiding spot. His instincts screamed at him to take cover, but just as he reached for his knife, the voice crackled through the radio, low and urgent. "Don't stop. Keep moving." Jackson's pulse spiked. The voice was growing fainter, more distorted, as though something was interfering with the signal. He couldn't afford to wait. Not now. The tower was close. He had to keep going. Pushing past the abandoned vehicle, he picked up his pace, weaving through the fog-covered streets. The further he went, the more he began to notice strange symbols painted on the walls, cryptic, almost like a warning. Arrows pointing this way, strange numbers, scratched-out messages that were barely legible. Do not trust them. The eyes are everywhere. Jackson's mind was racing. Was it another group of survivors, marking their territory? Or something more sinister? He had to be careful. Suddenly, his flashlight flickered and went out. A soft, metallic click echoed in the silence. For a moment, everything was pitch black. Jackson froze, his heart hammering in his chest. The oppressive silence felt deafening, and for the first time, he realized just how alone he was. He fumbled with the flashlight, desperately trying to get it to work, but it refused to turn back on. Then, a shadow flickered at the edge of his vision. His breath caught in his throat. He wasn't imagining it. There was something, or someone, there. Jackson's instincts kicked in. He pulled his knife from its sheath, ready to defend himself. But before he could move, a voice broke the silence, a raspy whisper that sent a chill down his spine. "Don't move." Jackson's heart stopped. The voice wasn't coming from the radio this time. It was coming from somewhere right in front of him. He strained his eyes in the darkness, trying to make out the figure standing just beyond the reach of his flashlight's beam. All he could see was a faint silhouette, a person, perhaps, but it was impossible to tell. The fog was too thick, the shadows too deep. "Who are you?" Jackson demanded, his voice shaking. The figure didn't answer. Instead, it moved, fast, disappearing into the mist with a fluidity that made Jackson's blood run cold. He hesitated, trying to listen for any signs of movement, but the only sound he heard was the faint crackling of his radio. "Follow the signal," the voice whispered, and then it was gone, leaving nothing but the empty streets and the eerie fog that seemed to close in around him. Jackson's pulse raced. What was that? Had it been another survivor? Or was it something worse? He didn't know what to think, but there was no time to waste. The radio tower was close. He couldn't stop now. He had to know what was waiting for him at the source of the signal. Taking a deep breath, Jackson pushed forward into the fog, his mind spinning with questions. Whatever was happening here, whatever game was being played, he knew one thing for certain: he couldn't afford to trust anyone, and he couldn't afford to stop moving. Jackson pressed on, his steps quickening as he moved deeper into the heart of the city. The fog seemed to grow thicker, enveloping him in a suffocating blanket that distorted everything around him. He could still hear the faint echoes of that strange voice on the radio, urging him forward. But now, there was an unsettling twist to it, something almost desperate. "Trust only the broadcast," the voice repeated, but this time, it was strained, almost as if the speaker was fighting to stay conscious. The real danger is closer than you think." His breath quickened as his mind raced. What was the real danger? Who was behind the broadcast? Was there anyone out there? Or had he been lured into a trap, the voice an illusion meant to lead him into a deadly situation? The tower loomed ahead, a dark monolith rising through the fog. Jackson couldn't see the full structure through the dense mist, but he could feel its presence, the hum of the electrical grid that powered it, the pulse of the radio signal coming from its peak. There was no turning back now. He had come this far. But as he drew closer, something felt wrong. The air was thick with a sense of foreboding. Jackson's footsteps faltered as his instincts screamed at him to stop. He had been in this city long enough to know that when the atmosphere changed like this, it was never a good sign. The feeling of being watched was back, stronger than before. He turned around, his eyes scanning the streets. The fog seemed to swallow up everything, blurring the line between reality and nightmare. The sounds of the undead, distant but constant, made the silence even more unbearable. His mind spun with theories. Had someone else heard the broadcast and was now following him? Were they waiting for him, hiding in the shadows? Suddenly, a sharp crack echoed through the air, followed by the unmistakable sound of shuffling footsteps. The undead. Jackson's heart pounded in his chest as he ducked into an alley, pulling his knife from its sheath. His breath was shallow, his pulse racing. He was surrounded, he could feel them closing in, could hear their guttural growls in the distance. The creatures were getting closer. With his back against the wall, he waited, trying to stay as still as possible, his ears straining for the sound of movement. They were close now, just a few feet away. Jackson knew that if he wasn't careful, he'd be their next meal. The steps grew louder. Then, from the corner of his eye, he saw them, two figures, shambling down the alley. They were slow, but their presence was unmistakable. Zombies. Their decayed, rotting faces barely resembled human beings anymore. The stench of death was overwhelming, and Jackson's stomach churned. He had no choice. He lunged from the shadows, moving quickly to avoid making noise. With one swift motion, he took down the first zombie, slashing at its throat with his knife. The second one stumbled forward, its arms reaching for him with unnatural speed. Jackson sidestepped, driving his blade into its skull with a quick, practiced motion. Both zombies collapsed to the ground, twitching, before finally going still. The alley fell silent once again, but Jackson could still hear the echo of his own breath in the quiet. His pulse slowed, but the tension didn't ease. He couldn't afford to let his guard down, not now. Then, as if summoned by his thoughts, the voice crackled once more through the radio, sharp and insistent. "Get to the tower. Don't stop. They know you're coming." The urgency in the voice sent a shiver down Jackson's spine. He wasn't alone here. Whoever had been broadcasting knew exactly what was happening in the city. And now, they were aware of his every move. But who was they? Were they survivors? A faction? Or something far more sinister? Jackson couldn't say, but one thing was certain, the radio tower wasn't just a beacon of hope. It was a place of unknowns, a place where the truth about this nightmare might finally be revealed, or where his journey could end. Taking a deep breath, he stood up, shaking off the lingering dread, and continued his march toward the tower. The fog parted slightly, offering a brief glimpse of the looming structure ahead. With every step, the realization grew clearer, something far bigger was at play, and Jackson had to reach the top of that tower, whatever the cost. Jackson's legs burned with exhaustion, but he couldn't afford to slow down now. The radio tower was only a few hundred yards away, its looming presence cutting through the fog like a dark sentinel. He could hear the hum of its electrical grid, a constant pulse that seemed to match the rhythm of his racing heart. The voice on the radio had been growing fainter, as though the broadcast itself was struggling to stay alive. It didn't make sense. Why would a signal that was supposed to lead him to safety be deteriorating? But Jackson had no time to dwell on the mystery. He was almost there. He moved swiftly through the fog, carefully avoiding any signs of movement in the streets. The last thing he needed now was to draw attention to himself, especially with the undead still lurking in the shadows. Each step seemed to echo louder than the last in the oppressive silence of the city. The air was thick with an eerie tension, as if something was waiting just beyond his sight, watching his every move. As he rounded a corner, the base of the radio tower finally came into view. It was massive, towering above him like a monument to a forgotten world. The metal structure was rusted and battered, but it stood tall, still broadcasting whatever message it had been meant to send out. Jackson's eyes scanned the area. There were no signs of other survivors, no other souls seeking refuge from the madness. Just the tower, and the thick fog that seemed to swallow everything whole. He approached the entrance, his eyes narrowing as he took in the sight of the rusted gates. They were partially ajar, as though someone had been here recently, or perhaps, the gate had simply been forced open by time or circumstance. The air around him felt charged, like static on the brink of a storm. The voice on the radio was almost inaudible now, but it had one last message for him. Don't trust what you find inside. They're waiting for you. Jackson froze. They're waiting for you. The words echoed in his mind as the gate creaked open, revealing the dimly lit interior of the tower's base. His heart rate spiked. The warning was too clear to ignore. But the radio had led him here. It had guided him this far. He couldn't turn back now. Taking a deep breath, Jackson stepped through the gate. The interior of the tower was cold and industrial, a series of metal stairs spiraling upward toward the top. The air was stale, carrying the scent of rust and decay. He could hear the faint hum of machinery working somewhere deeper within, but the place was strangely quiet. Too quiet. Jackson moved cautiously, his footsteps echoing on the cold metal. As he climbed the stairs, his hand instinctively went to the knife at his side. The higher he climbed, the more the sense of unease grew. It wasn't just the decay of the tower that unnerved him, it was the fact that everything about this place felt wrong. He had expected signs of life, other survivors, perhaps a camp of people desperate for help. Instead, there was nothing. No lights, no voices, just the whirring of machines, the hum of the broadcast, and the oppressive silence that seemed to close in on him. As he neared the top of the tower, he saw something strange, a faint light flickering at the end of the stairwell. It wasn't a light he'd seen before, not from any power source. It was the eerie, unnatural glow of something alive. The hairs on the back of his neck stood up. With every step, the static from his radio grew louder, until it was nearly deafening. He could hear the voice again, the one that had been guiding him. It was faint, but urgent. "Get out of here, they're waiting for you." But it was too late. Jackson reached the top of the tower, and what he found there made his blood run cold. The broadcast equipment was in disarray, wires and cables hanging loose, and a large, archaic radio transmitter was still flickering with weak signals. But that wasn't what caught his attention. At the center of the room was a strange, glowing device, humming softly as it pulsed with a faint green light. And then he saw them, figures standing in the shadows. Two men, their faces obscured by dark hoods, standing motionless as if they had been waiting for him. Jackson's breath caught in his throat. They weren't undead. They were alive. But there was something unsettling about them. Something wrong. They didn't speak, but their eyes, cold, calculating, watched him, as if they knew exactly who he was and why he was here. Jackson's hand tightened around the handle of his knife. His mind raced, trying to process what was happening. These weren't survivors trying to help. These were something else. In the broadcast? It hadn't been a lifeline. It had been a lure. "Welcome," one of the figures finally said, his voice low and smooth, sending a chill down Jackson's spine. "We've been waiting for you." Jackson's grip tightened around the handle of his knife, his pulse quickening as the two figures remained motionless in front of him. The air in the room seemed to thicken, as though the weight of the unknown pressed down on him from all sides. The soft glow of the mysterious device at the center of the room cast eerie shadows on the walls, distorting the figures in a way that made them appear even more ominous. "We've been waiting for you," the first figure repeated, his voice colder now, like the words were coming from somewhere deep within the shadows themselves. Jackson didn't respond. His eyes scanned the room, searching for an escape, a way out. But the metal stairwell he'd just ascended now seemed miles away, and the only exit was the same as the one he had entered, the rusted gate behind him. But he couldn't leave. Not now. Not with the strange device humming quietly, its unnatural green glow flickering like a heartbeat. He had to understand what was happening. "What is this?" Jackson finally asked, his voice steady, though the fear gnawed at the back of his mind. "Who are you?" The second figure stepped forward, his head falling back to reveal a face that looked far too familiar. It was weathered, with sharp features that spoke of hardship and loss. But it was his eyes that caught Jackson's attention, dark, hollow, and devoid of emotion. Jackson froze. He knew that face. "Remember me?" the man said with a smile that sent a chill down Jackson's spine. "We've met before. You just don't remember." Jackson's mind reeled. The face was familiar, but he couldn't place it. His memory was a blur, jumbled with the horrors of the last few months. The man before him had to be someone from his past, someone important, but the name escaped him. The face, though, it lingered in his mind, like a forgotten dream. "I don't know you," Jackson said, taking a cautious step back. The man's smile faltered for a moment, replaced by a look of pity. He exchanged a glance with the first figure, who nodded as though giving permission for something unspoken. "We were all part of the plan," the first figure said, his voice now almost gentle, but there was a dangerous undertone lurking beneath the surface. "The signal, the broadcast, it was meant to bring you here. To show you the truth." "The truth?" Jackson asked, his heart thudding in his chest. His mind was spinning. "This doesn't make sense." "Yes, the truth," the second figure confirmed, stepping closer to the glowing device. "The world didn't end because of the virus. That was just the beginning. This," he gestured toward the device, "is how it all started." Jackson's eyes narrowed. "What are you talking about?" The first figure's gaze turned cold, his eyes narrowing as he crossed the room to stand by the device. The virus was a cover-up. A distraction. The real enemy, Jackson, was never the undead. He paused for a moment, as if letting the weight of the words settle in the air. It was us. The ones who created the broadcast. The ones who used the technology to manipulate everything. The ones who set this entire apocalypse into motion. Jackson's head was spinning. What the hell were they saying? You did this? You're responsible for all of this? His voice rose in disbelief. Not we, the second figure corrected, his tone oddly detached. The program. He gestured to the device again. You were supposed to be part of it, Jackson. You were supposed to help us finish what we started. A cold realization washed over him. He looked from one figure to the other, trying to piece together what they were saying. What do you mean, help? The first figure stepped forward, his eyes never leaving Jackson. The broadcast, it's not just a signal. It's a beacon. A way to communicate with others. It's a way to bring about a new world order. We thought you could be the key, your survival instincts, your drive. We created you for this. Jackson staggered backward. Created him? What did that even mean? He didn't understand, couldn't begin to grasp the enormity of what was being said. His mind scrambled for answers, but there were none. The pieces didn't fit. This is insanity, he whispered, his voice shaking. You're telling me this whole world, this nightmare, was planned? And I'm supposed to be part of it? Yes, the second figure replied, his tone now soft, almost sympathetic. You were chosen to survive, Jackson. Chosen to lead us into the next phase of evolution. Jackson's hands clenched into fists. He felt the ground beneath him begin to shift, as if the foundation of his entire reality was crumbling away. No. I didn't ask for this. I didn't choose any of this. He took a step toward the device, his eyes narrowing as the hum grew louder, more intense. You don't have a choice, the first figure said, his voice cold and final. You're here now. And you'll help us complete the transmission. Or we'll make sure that you don't leave. Ever. Jackson's stomach turned. The figures weren't just manipulating events, they were playing God. The broadcast, the strange device, the undead hordes that roamed the earth, they were all part of a bigger, more sinister plan. And Jackson? He was a pawn in it. His mind raced, and for a moment, he considered the options in front of him. Escape? He didn't have the means. Fight? He had no idea what these people, these creators, were capable of. The tower was their domain, and Jackson was trapped within it. But as the humming intensified, and the voices grew louder in his head, one thought became clear: he couldn't let them win. He couldn't let the world end like this, not on their terms. With a swift motion, Jackson lunged toward the device, his fingers desperately reaching for the switch. Jackson's hand flew toward the glowing device, his fingers trembling with a mix of fear and resolve. The hum of the machinery grew deafening, the static from the radio echoing louder in his mind, drowning out his thoughts. He had no time to think, only to act. The weight of everything that had happened, everything he had endured, was too much. He couldn't let these people control the outcome. He wouldn't let their twisted plan succeed. Before he could make contact, the second figure moved, faster than Jackson had anticipated, grabbing his wrist with an unnatural strength. The grip tightened painfully, sending a shock of pain through his arm. You think you can stop this? The second figure hissed, his voice cold and mocking. You don't even understand what you're dealing with. You were never meant to escape. You were meant to fulfill a purpose. Jackson twisted, trying to free himself, but the grip was ironclad. The figure's eyes were locked onto his, unblinking, as if trying to force Jackson to understand the futility of his resistance. You think that just because you're surviving this world, you can change the outcome? The first figure spoke now, his voice laced with condescension. The world is already lost. All we're doing is accelerating what was always meant to happen. This was never about the zombies, Jackson. This was about control. Power. With all his might, Jackson yanked his arm free, catching the second figure off guard for a moment. In that split second, he reached forward and slammed his hand down onto the device's control panel. The room erupted in a blinding flash of light, the hum of the machinery suddenly spiking to an unbearable crescendo. Jackson could hear the figures behind him shouting something, warning him, pleading with him to stop, but it was too late. His fingers had already pressed the sequence of buttons that began to unravel the entire system. The device sputtered, sending out a series of erratic signals. The air seemed to crackle with static as the ground beneath Jackson's feet trembled. The once steady rhythm of the broadcast faltered, replaced by a series of garbled, distorted voices, overlapping in a cacophony of static and noise. "No!" the second figure yelled, charging toward him. But Jackson was already moving. He had no idea what he was doing, he didn't have a plan, but the surge of adrenaline in his veins propelled him forward. The first figure's voice broke through the chaos. "You don't understand. You're unleashing something worse than the undead. The signal will destabilize everything, it will destroy what little we have left." But Jackson didn't care. He couldn't. The truth that had been hidden from him, the lies about this world, the manipulation, he couldn't let it continue. There had to be something better than the life they had planned for him. Even if he didn't know what the future would hold, even if it meant facing an unknown horror, it was better than being a puppet in their hands. The final button clicked into place, and with a sharp screeching sound, the device's light flickered and dimmed. For a brief moment, everything went silent, so silent, in fact, that Jackson thought he had done it. He had stopped them. But as he exhaled, the silence was shattered by an overwhelming, deafening sound, the sound of the ground shaking violently beneath him, the tower groaning as if in pain. Something was happening. Something was changing. Then, just as suddenly as it had started, the radio's static cleared. A single voice came through, distorted, but unmistakably clear. It was the same voice that had guided him here. "Jackson," the voice crackled again. "You shouldn't have done that. You've unleashed the signal. You've unleashed them." Before he could even react, the first figure lunged toward him, his face twisted in a rage that Jackson had never seen before. "You fool," the figure screamed. "You don't know what you've done. You've just triggered a wave, a signal that will reach beyond this world." The air around them began to hum again, but this time, it was different. The glow from the device flickered violently, as if it was fighting against the disintegration Jackson had caused. The tower groaned once more, but there was something else, a distant rumbling sound, almost like thunder, rising from beneath the ground. "What did you do?" the second figure gasped, his eyes widening in horror. "You've just..." Before he could finish, the tower trembled violently, throwing Jackson off balance. The figures stumbled, their feet scrambling for purchase as the floor beneath them seemed to shift, as if the entire structure was being torn apart. Jackson staggered to his feet, his mind racing as he realized what was happening. He hadn't just stopped the broadcast. He'd broken something far bigger. Whatever it was that the figures had been trying to control, whatever they had set into motion with the broadcast, was now spiraling out of control. And Jackson had just made it worse. From outside the tower, he could hear it, a distant, rumbling growl, rising from the depths of the earth. The undead, yes, but there was something else. Something new. A sound like something far more ancient, far more dangerous, had been awakened. And Jackson was caught in the middle. "Get out," the first figure shouted, scrambling toward him, but it was too late. The ground beneath them began to crack, the tower shaking violently as though it was coming apart at the seams. Jackson had no choice. He sprinted toward the stairs, his legs burning with the effort, the tower shaking with every step he took. Behind him, the figures screamed in desperation, but Jackson didn't stop. The only thing that mattered now was getting out of the tower, getting out before whatever was coming found him. The door was in sight. He was so close. But the rumbling grew louder. The tower groaned again, and as Jackson pushed through the gate, he felt the entire structure begin to collapse behind him. The signal had been broken, but in its place, something far worse was waking up. The ground beneath Jackson's feet trembled as he raced through the crumbling entrance, heart pounding in his chest. He could feel the heat of the collapsing tower behind him, the shockwave of destruction pushing him forward, urging him to run faster, harder, as though the very earth was trying to swallow him whole. His breath came in ragged gasps, his legs screaming from the strain of his desperate escape. Every step seemed to carry him further from the nightmare of the tower, yet closer to an unknown terror. The noise from behind grew louder, the groaning of metal, the shattering of stone, and Jackson didn't dare look back. He couldn't afford to. He had no idea what was happening, but the overwhelming sense of urgency told him that his survival depended on getting far away as possible. Then, the ground beneath him cracked. Jackson's foot caught in a fissure, and he stumbled, nearly falling face-first into the dirt. He barely managed to catch himself, pain shooting up his leg as he pushed through it. His mind raced, scrambling for clarity, trying to make sense of the chaos surrounding him. The rumbling had intensified, but it wasn't just from the collapsing tower. It was something else. Something bigger. Something alive. His eyes darted around, searching for an escape route. He had no idea where he was now. He was miles from the tower, surrounded by nothing but the dense, shadowed forest. The sky above was thick with clouds, dark and roiling like a storm was about to break. And then he heard it. A distant, bone-chilling growl. It wasn't the groan of the undead. It wasn't the slow, moaning sound of their decaying bodies lurching through the wasteland. No, this was different. This was something deep and primal. Something ancient. Jackson's heart skipped a beat. He didn't know what that sound was, but it filled him with a sense of dread so deep that it rooted him to the spot for a moment. He could almost feel the vibrations in the air, like the very earth was alive and restless, reacting to something unseen. What have I unleashed? Before he could gather his bearings, the growl came again, louder this time. Closer. His instincts kicked in. He turned and ran, sprinting through the trees, ignoring the branches that scratched at his face, the underbrush that tripped him up. There was no time to think. The world around him was shifting, unraveling, and Jackson was caught in the middle of it. Behind him, the sound grew louder, more pronounced. Now, it wasn't just one growl. It was a chorus, a cacophony of deep, guttural noises that seemed to echo through the trees like a warning. Jackson skidded to a halt at the edge of a ravine. His chest heaved with exhaustion, his mind racing. There was nowhere left to run. The figures in the tower had told him the truth. He'd just set off a chain reaction, and now the consequences were unfolding. The broadcast, the device, it was never meant to simply control the undead. It had awakened something far worse, something buried beneath the earth for centuries. And now, whatever it was coming for him. A cold wind swept through the trees, and Jackson's breath caught in his throat. He turned, his eyes scanning the darkness, searching for movement, for any sign of what was hunting him. There was nothing at first. Just the silent, oppressive quiet of the night. Then, through the darkness, he saw it. A figure, large and looming, its eyes glowing in the moonlight. It was massive, towering above the trees, its shape barely visible through the shadowed branches. The thing moved with an unnatural fluidity, its elongated limbs bending and stretching in ways that no human body should. And then, more followed. More shapes, emerging from the shadows, their eyes glowing with that same eerie light, their bodies twisted and contorted, like they were something other than human. The broadcast didn't just wake the undead. Jackson thought, a cold realization sweeping over him. It woke them all. His pulse quickened, his breath shallow as he took a step back, eyes fixed on the creatures in the distance. They were moving closer, slowly but surely. There was no way out. For a moment, panic threatened to overwhelm him. But then, he remembered something, the voices from the device. The warning. These creatures, whatever they were part of the plan. They were part of the endgame. He had been chosen to break the signal, but now, he needed to survive what had been unleashed. His survival instincts kicked into overdrive. He turned, looking for a way to escape. The ravine was too steep to climb, the forest too dense to navigate quickly. He needed a plan, something to buy him time, but what? What could he do against these things? He heard the growls again, closer now, the sound reverberating through the ground. They were almost upon him. Desperation fueled his thoughts. He couldn't fight them, but he could run. He knew these woods. He had trained in them for years before the world fell apart. Maybe, just maybe, he could find a way to lose them in the dense underbrush. But as he took one last look at the creatures closing in on him, one thought filled his mind. This isn't the end. It's just the beginning. The signal had been broken, yes, but the world had only just begun to shift into something unrecognizable. The undead were no longer the only threat. There were far darker forces lurking in the shadows, forces that Jackson could never have imagined. And as the first creature lunged toward him, he knew one thing for sure: survival wasn't enough anymore. He would have to fight for something more. With that, he ran. And the shadows followed. End of Part 8. End of the story.